There's a box in your pantry right now, probably on the second shelf next to the cake mix and the instant pudding, with a photograph on the front of a warm, molten brownie, a fork pulling through a gooey center, chocolate so rich it looks like it's glowing. That photograph was engineered by a food stylist. The box was engineered by a marketing team. And the powder inside, the powder you pour into a bowl, stir with egg and oil and slide into a 350-degree oven, was engineered by food scientists working in labs thousands of miles from your kitchen. Tonight, I want to tell you what's actually in that powder. Not the top-line label, not the friendly descriptor, but the full ingredient panel and the industrial processes behind each line. By the end, you'll know what you're feeding your family when you bake from a box, and you'll have a clearer sense of whether the convenience is worth the cost. Stay with me, because the brownie aisle is one of the most chemically complex corners of the supermarket, and the shoppers who buy its products tend to be the ones least likely to examine them closely. Let me anchor this in the authority record. The Food and Drug Administration regulates packaged baking mixes under its processed food framework, which means every ingredient must be generally recognized as safe or approved as a food additive. The agency permits a wide range of colorants, emulsifiers, preservatives, and flavoring compounds in baking mixes, and the list of permitted additives has grown substantially since the mid-20th century. The World Health Organization and the American Heart Association have both produced guidance on added sugars in processed foods, with research indicating that chronic high intake may contribute to metabolic concerns, including insulin resistance, elevated triglycerides, and dental outcomes. Peer-reviewed nutrition studies, including work published in JAMA Internal Medicine and in pediatric nutrition journals, have examined ultra-processed food consumption and found associations that suggest these categories deserve more dietary attention than they typically receive. The Center for Science in the Public Interest has compiled petitions and reports on specific additives used in baked good mixes, flagging several as candidates for tighter regulation. When we combine the FDA ingredient record, the WHO and AHA guidance on sugar, and the independent advocacy research, the picture that emerges for boxed brownie mix is of a product category that meets current regulatory standards but carries a nutritional profile that many public health voices argue is not ideal for frequent family consumption. Start with the obvious ingredient, sugar. A typical serving of prepared boxed brownies can deliver 18 to 25 grams of sugar, depending on the brand and the serving size. Bake the whole pan, divide into realistic portions, and you may find that a single average brownie squares delivers close to the American Heart Association's recommended added sugar limit for a child for an entire day. Sugar in brownie mix is not just sweetness. It's also a functional ingredient that drives moisture retention, browning chemistry, and mouthfeel. Most mixes list it as the first or second ingredient, which under FDA regulations means it is the most or second most abundant ingredient by weight. When sugar is the dominant component of a food by mass, the product is definitionally a confection, regardless of how the packaging describes it. The fat system in boxed brownie mix is where chemistry gets interesting. Traditional home brownies use butter, a whole food whose ingredient list is one item long. Boxed mixes instead rely on a variety of fat substitutes, sometimes blended into the dry mix and sometimes added by the home baker as oil. The dry mix fat is often a combination of palm oil, palm kernel oil, or fractionated palm derivatives, sometimes supplemented with intraesterified vegetable oils designed to mimic the performance of shortening without using partially hydrogenated fats. Research published in lipid science journals has documented that intrasterified oils, while technically free of the trans fats the FDA has moved against, carry their own metabolic signature that studies suggest may contribute to altered lipid profiles in some consumers. Palm-based fats raise their own issues around refining byproducts, with European regulators in particular having flagged certain glycidyl esters and 3-MCPD compounds formed during palm oil refining as substances warranting reduction. Then there's the cocoa question. A brownie, in theory, is built around chocolate. Look at a typical boxed mix, however, and you'll find cocoa powder listed somewhere in the middle of the ingredient panel, often behind sugar, flour, and fat. The cocoa used in commodity mixes is frequently alkalized, a process sometimes called Dutching, in which the cocoa is treated with potassium carbonate to raise the pH, mellow the flavor, and deepen the color. Alkalized cocoa is perfectly safe and widely used, but research has shown that the alkalization process reduces the flavanol content of the cocoa significantly, and flavanols are the compounds associated with many of the cardiovascular benefits cited in chocolate research. A home brownie made with high-quality natural cocoa delivers a different polyphenol profile than a boxed mix built on heavily Dutched commodity cocoa, even if both taste chocolatey. Now, the flour. Most brownie mixes use enriched bleached wheat flour, which has been chemically treated to whiten the color and accelerate aging, then fortified with synthetic forms of certain B vitamins and iron to replace nutrients removed during refining. The FDA requires enrichment for legal reasons, but independent nutrition research suggests that the synthetic fortification does not fully replicate the complex nutrient matrix found in whole grain flours. Studies indicate that diets built heavily around refined, enriched grains may contribute to blood sugar volatility and longer-term metabolic concerns compared with diets emphasizing whole grains. Consider the emulsifier and stabilizer stack. Boxed brownie mixes commonly contain mono- and diglycerides, polysorbate 60 or similar compounds, soy lecithin, xanthan gum, and guar gum, all working together to bind water, keep fat distributed evenly, and produce the gooey center effect the front of the box promises. Each of these ingredients is approved for food use and considered safe at regulated intake levels. However, emerging research, including studies published in gut health and microbiome journals, has explored how certain dietary emulsifiers may affect the intestinal lining and the composition of gut bacteria when consumed regularly. The science is still evolving, and the research has not established definitive harm at normal dietary levels. But the accumulating body of evidence suggests that ultra-processed foods built on emulsifier-heavy formulations may carry effects that simpler homemade equivalents do not. Flavor and color chemistry deserve their own paragraph. Boxed brownie mixes almost always list natural and artificial flavors, a category that under FDA regulations can contain hundreds of distinct flavoring compounds without specific disclosure. For most consumers, this is unremarkable. For consumers with sensitivities to specific aromatic compounds, to propylene glycol carriers, to certain synthesized esters, the opacity of the natural and artificial flavors line can make it nearly impossible to identify a trigger. Colorants used in some mixes include caramel color, which comes in several forms. Certain types of caramel color, particularly those produced with ammonia compounds, have been scrutinized for trace byproducts like 4-methylimidazole, which California has listed under its Proposition 65 framework as a substance of concern. Regulatory agencies in the broader United States consider these byproducts safe at typical dietary exposures, but the debate is ongoing, and consumers have reasonable grounds to prefer products that use less processed coloring systems. Consider preservatives. Extending shelf life in a boxed mix that needs to survive months in warehouses and on grocery shelves requires preservatives like TBHQ, tertibutylhydroquinone, BHT, or BHA. Research on TBHQ in particular has produced mixed findings. The FDA considers it safe at permitted levels, but some peer-reviewed studies have raised questions about cumulative exposure effects, and several major food brands have voluntarily removed it from their products in response to consumer demand. A boxed mix that lists TBHQ, BHT, or BHA is not illegal, but it is carrying preservative chemistry that many modern food producers have chosen to avoid. Let's think about what happens when all of this combines in the pan. You add eggs, you add oil, you stir, you bake. The egg brings cholesterol, protein, and emulsifying power. The oil, typically vegetable oil chosen by the home baker, brings additional fat. And here's where the refining process concern compounds. If you're using a heavily refined commodity soybean oil from the grocery store, you're adding another layer of processed fat to a product already heavy with processed fat from the dry mix. The finished brownie, by the time it comes out of the oven, can contain 3 separate processed fat systems: the palm-based dry fat, the added oil, and the egg yolk fat, layered over a sugar, refined flour, and emulsifier base. Nutrition scientists increasingly refer to products like this as ultra-processed foods, a category that has been the subject of extensive epidemiological research. Large cohort studies, including analyses published in journals like the BMJ, have examined ultra-processed food consumption and found associations that suggest higher intake may contribute to various long-term health outcomes. The effect sizes are modest, the relationships are correlational, but the pattern is consistent enough that public health researchers have begun treating ultra-processed foods as a distinct dietary category worth limiting. Here's a reality check on what I am and am not saying. An occasional pan of boxed brownies will not harm a healthy family. The human body is remarkably capable of handling occasional exposure to processed ingredients, and brownies as a treat food in a diet built otherwise on whole ingredients are not the enemy. What I am saying is that if brownies are a weekly or bi-weekly ritual in your household, if they're going into school lunches on Fridays, if they're the default dessert at every family gathering, the cumulative exposure profile starts to matter. And if the mix you're reaching for is the cheapest one on the shelf, the one with the longest ingredient list and the most industrial fat and preservative system, the cumulative exposure is the most concerning version of itself. Let me bring in the acrylamide conversation, because it applies directly to baked brownie products. Acrylamide is a compound formed when starchy foods are heated at high temperatures, particularly through the Maillard reaction that produces the appealing browned surfaces of baked and fried foods. The World Health Organization has included acrylamide among dietary compounds worth monitoring, and the FDA has issued guidance to food manufacturers aimed at reducing acrylamide formation in processed foods. Baked goods made with commodity ingredients, particularly those using refined flours and high-sugar formulations, can be meaningful contributors to cumulative acrylamide exposure in a family's diet. Home baking at slightly lower temperatures for slightly shorter times, with eyes on the moment when the edges just begin to darken, can meaningfully reduce the acrylamide load compared with baking to deeply browned, crisp edges. For families eating baked goods frequently, The cumulative difference over a year of sundaes is worth considering. Consider the question of what the average boxed brownie actually contains per serving when the finished product is sliced realistically rather than by the optimistic portions listed on the box. The nutrition label often assumes a pan cut into 16 or 20 pieces, but most households cut into 9 or 12. This means the actual consumed portion is often 50 to 100% larger than the label portion, and the sugar, fat, and calorie loads scale accordingly. A serving listed at 18 grams of sugar, consumed as a real-world-sized brownie, might deliver 30 grams. That's equivalent to more than 2 teaspoons of added sugar in a single dessert. And for a child eating 2 such brownies after dinner, the evening's added sugar intake can approach or exceed what most pediatric nutrition guidelines recommend for the entire day. Let me take a moment to talk about the difference between baking for nostalgia and baking for convenience. The boxed mix industry markets heavily on the idea that it delivers the warm, nostalgic experience of home baking without the effort. But the actual experience of making brownies from scratch, measuring cocoa, melting butter, cracking eggs, stirring gently, is one of the foundational sensory experiences that makes baking feel meaningful. When the process is reduced to tearing open a packet and adding oil, you may be saving 20 minutes of time, but you are also trading away the ritual that made home baking special in the first place. Many families who have shifted back to scratch baking have reported not just better products, but a more satisfying experience overall. And the time cost turns out to be much smaller than the marketing of boxed mixes implies. There is an often overlooked question about the palm oil used in many boxed brownie mixes. Palm oil is valued in baked goods manufacturing because it is solid at room temperature without requiring hydrogenation, giving products a desired texture without the trans fats that partial hydrogenation used to create. But palm oil production has its own concerns, including environmental impact on tropical rainforests and the social conditions of palm cultivation in certain regions. Beyond the sustainability angle, the refining process for palm oil can produce certain byproducts that European regulators have flagged for reduction, and some premium baking mix brands have shifted to other fat systems in response to both consumer and regulatory pressure. A brownie mix that lists palm oil without any sustainability or sourcing certification is carrying both a nutritional and an ethical question that the package does not address directly. The inclusion of nuts and chocolate chips in some mixes adds an additional ingredient layer worth noting. Chocolate chips in mixes often contain cocoa butter substitutes, lecithin emulsifiers, and cheaper chocolate bases than what you would find in premium chocolate bars. Nuts in mixes, particularly walnuts and pecans, can sometimes arrive with aflatoxin concerns if the source nuts were improperly stored before inclusion. Aflatoxin is a mycotoxin produced by certain molds that can grow on stored nuts, and regulatory tolerance levels exist for aflatoxin in food, but independent testing has occasionally found nut-containing products exceeding those levels. Buying plain brownie mixes and adding your own chocolate chips and nuts from trusted sources gives you better control over these secondary ingredients. Consider what happens at the chemical level when a boxed brownie bakes. The dry mix contains all the precursors: flour, sugar, cocoa, fat, leaveners, emulsifiers, arranged for shelf stability. Adding eggs and oil introduces moisture and additional fat, which allows the emulsifiers to do their work and the starches to hydrate. The oven heat triggers the Maillard reaction between sugars and proteins on the surface, caramelization of sugars, denaturation of egg proteins, gelatinization of starches, melting of fats, and dissipation of leavening gases. All of that chemistry is remarkable when it happens with clean ingredients. When it happens with a commodity mix full of engineered additives, the same chemistry produces a product that is engineered to hit specific sensory targets. A pulled-apart, gooey center, a thin, crackly top. Intense sweetness that registers immediately on the tongue. These sensory targets are not the product of natural baking. They are the product of formulation. Home brownies are imperfect in comparison by design, and some of that imperfection is what makes them feel like real food. Let me share an observation from parents who have attempted to transition kids from boxed mixes to scratch baking. The resistance is usually brief. Most kids, particularly when they participate in the making, actually prefer homemade brownies once they try them. The deeper chocolate flavor, the more satisfying texture, and the sense of ownership over the process tend to win them over within a batch or two. The exception is kids who have become highly adapted to the hyper-palatable formulation of boxed mixes, and who will initially report the homemade version as less sweet or less fudgy. For these kids, starting with enhanced homemade recipes that include quality chocolate chips and a slightly more indulgent approach can bridge the gap, with gradual moderation over weeks. Consider the gluten-free boxed brownie mix category, which has grown significantly. Gluten-free mixes are a legitimate option for families managing celiac disease or verified gluten sensitivity, but the products are not automatically healthier than their wheat-based counterparts. Many gluten-free brownie mixes rely on rice flour, tapioca starch, potato starch, and various gums to replicate the structure that gluten normally provides. The resulting ingredient panel can be longer and more processed than a conventional mix. For consumers without a medical need to avoid gluten, switching to a gluten-free mix as a perceived health upgrade often results in consuming a more processed product, not a less processed one. So here is how I'd advise you to rebuild your brownie game with more intention. First, learn to make brownies from scratch. A classic fudge brownie recipe requires 6 ingredients: butter, sugar, eggs, cocoa, flour, and salt, with optional vanilla and chocolate chips. Total active time is about 10 minutes. Total cost is often less than the equivalent boxed mix. The transparency is complete, and the finished product is usually better. Second, if you prefer the convenience of a mix, read the ingredient panel closely and favor mixes with fewer than 10 items. Some cleaner brownie mixes exist, built around real cocoa, whole grain flour, cane sugar, and a simple fat system. They cost more, but deliver a product closer to what brownies are supposed to be. Third, look for third-party certifications rather than marketing words. USDA Organic, Non-GMO Project Verified, Fair Trade certifications on the cocoa. These labels carry audit requirements that the words rich, decadent, and fudgy do not. Fourth, when you do use a mix, upgrade the home-added ingredients. Use real butter instead of vegetable oil when the package permits. Use pasture-raised eggs if you can. Add a teaspoon of real vanilla extract and a handful of good chocolate chips. These upgrades improve both the flavor and the ingredient profile meaningfully. Fifth, think about portion. Commercial brownie pans are cut into generous squares that contain a meaningful sugar and fat load. Cut smaller portions, serve them as part of a plate that includes fresh fruit or a protein-rich accompaniment, and keep the ritual intact while reducing the impact. Sixth, rotate your dessert categories. If brownies are one option in a monthly dessert rotation rather than the default dessert every weekend, the occasional boxed mix matters far less. Seventh, involve your kids in the preparation. Children who bake alongside a parent develop a healthier relationship with food than children who receive treats as packaged items. And the transfer of skill is a kind of long-term protection no label can replicate. Before you wrap up and return to your evening, let me leave you with this. The brownie on the front of the box is an engineered image of a food engineered to match it. There is nothing wrong with enjoying brownies. The ritual is beloved for good reason, and a warm, gooey square shared with people you love is one of life's small pleasures. What I want for your family is for that pleasure to cost less than the cumulative processed food exposure many boxed mixes carry. Make more from scratch. Read the mixes you do buy with the eye of someone who has read a few hundred ingredient panels. Teach the kids to measure and stir. And the next time you reach for that box in the pantry, flip it over before you open it, because the back of a brownie mix has far more to tell you than the front ever will. And what you learn there may change your Sunday baking forever.